Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about the ships that surrounded the Titanic. Now, what I mean by this are three ships specifically. The first is the Californian. The second was the Carpathia. And lastly, the Mackay Bennett, which you may not be aware of, but that was the ship that was sent out to find the victims floating in the water. And there's an interesting story with all of that. But the Californian, first off, has always been stated as the ship that never came to the Titanic's rescue. Now, there's a lot of controversy in all of this. The captain of the Californian was Stanley Lord. And Stanley Lord's career was pretty well destroyed by this court case. Now, the interesting thing is that the Californian was part of a big corporation called IMM. That was the owner of the shipping company. Turns out that IMM was also the owner of the Titanic. Therefore, they weren't going to give the company a really hard time, but they sure made a scapegoat out of the captain. Captain Lord fought tooth and nail to write his name. Even as close to the 50th anniversary of the disaster, he tried to reopen the case. And then he, of course, passed away, and others have tried in his stead. The Carpathia, which was under the control of Captain Rostron at the time, was a plodding canarder that was not designed to move fast. It was more like a luxury boat that could kind of travel and do cruises and the like. And the Carpathia, it couldn't get out of its own way. I mean, it was a very slow ship. It was a very comfortable, easygoing ship. And then when this all happened, of course, Captain Rostron had to have everything changed on the ship. Since the ship at top speed could do 14 knots, he said that's not enough. He turned off the heat. He put every available piece of steam into the boilers to a dangerous degree to get the ship up to about 17 and a half knots. That's pretty incredible when you think that's about 20 miles an hour, practically. And to get that plodding Carpathia doing 20 miles an hour through the water is pretty doggone incredible. And they did it. And the interesting thing was, the Californian and the Carpathia, after all of this news about the Titanic, would both sink. The Californian would sink during World War I, as would the Carpathia. So all the three ships, the Titanic, the Carpathia, and the Californian, they all are at the bottom of the Atlantic. Interesting to note. Now, the Mackay Bennett, which picked up all the victims that were floating, ones they could find, they buried a lot at sea because of decomposition or basically, sadly to say, class. But it brought back a large number of victims, which are now buried, a vast majority of them, in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It's an interesting thing about that ship, it did not sink. It was an old ship when it was used to pick up the victims. In fact, it was about 26 years old, which is pretty old for a ship. That ship would sail for another 10 years after that, being retired in 1922. It was turned into a storage ship, basically. And interestingly enough, it would remain so until 1963. You would think by 1963 someone might have said, there's a lot of history behind this ship. But no one thought so, and it was scrapped. But it's interesting to look at those 3 other ships that were involved in the Titanic story. We always hear about the Californian. Well, it was owned by the same company that owned the Titanic. We've always heard about the Carpathia, plotting ship, sadly sunk during World War I. And of course the Mackay Bennett that actually survived for over 50 years after the sinking of the Titanic. But sadly, no one thought of saving it. But that is history. Just some thoughts I was thinking of as I was hanging out here and relaxing and thinking about stuff. And the ships that surrounded the Titanic came to mind. I thought it would be kind of interesting to talk about. Well, thank you and good night.